This is episode 317 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is made possible by our patrons. Become a patron today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hello, I'm Nick Humphrey, Curator of Furniture at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Some existing letters, we find reference to individuals in London, communities even, of deaf people, and those that were close to them who were signing, so natural signing.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
British Sign Language has existed in some form among deaf communities, at least since the 15th century, when some of the earliest records of sign language reveal descriptions of specific signs, many of which are still in use today. However, for Shakespeare's lifetime, sign language was far from formalized among the deaf and certainly not widely accepted by the hearing community. Similarly, education of the deaf, in terms of schools established to educate the deaf, mute, or otherwise alternatively abled, would not take root in England until after Shakespeare's lifetime. And that wasn't until well into the 18th century that became a solid establishment. To help us understand what life was like for a deaf person in Shakespeare's lifetime, as well as what signs existed and what records we have from the late 16th and early 17th century for deaf people, sign language, and the deaf community for Shakespeare's lifetime, is our guest, Mary Lutze. Dr. Mary Lutze is an assistant professor of English and the director of the Writing Center at the University of Arkansas Fort Smith. She has presented and published essays on disability studies, deaf theater, and the development of deaf theater theory. Find out more about Mary and her work in disability studies and communication in our show notes for today's episode. Hello, Mary. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello. I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
What is the phrase natural signing, and how does that compare or differ from what we think of as British Sign Language?
So what we know today as British Sign Language was not considered an established or standardized language until actually 2003, if you can believe that. So it was designated with the name British Sign Language in 1975, but it took a while for it to be considered a standardized language. So BSL, British Sign Language, like any language, had variations and developments based on those who used it, especially throughout history. So when we use the term natural signing, this is used to denote a gestural form of communication that served kind of like as a proto-sign language, the proto-BSL. It would not have been standardized again at that time, and it may even have varied in usage between individuals from family to family, just based on how they conceived of it and developed it themselves. And it wasn't commonly recorded. So a rich language really belonging to the early modern deaf and those that they regularly communicated with is in large part lost to us now. And in some extant letters, so some existing letters, we find reference to individuals in London, communities even, of deaf people and those that were close to them who were signing, so natural signing. And we know for sure then that deaf people were signing, but that much like today, actually, hearing people were pretty ignorant about the language other than to view it as a novelty or even a source of entertainment.
Shakespeare's works call attention to different levels of deafness. Falstaff claims to be deaf, instructing his boy to, quote, "tell him I am deaf," end quote. Then the boy suggests that the visitor speak louder because Falstaff is deaf. And that jumps out at me because it suggests Falstaff was pretending to be incompletely deaf and that there was this concept that deafness wasn't a total lack of audio abilities. So later, other references suggest that somebody can lose their hearing from loud noises, which is a different situation, obviously, from someone born deaf. So what was society's response to deaf people? And were there different responses based on whether you were born completely deaf or if you lost your hearing later in life due to accident, injury, or aging?
That's a great question. And to provide a full answer to it, I feel like it needs a little bit of context. So I'm a disability studies scholar as well as an early modern scholar. And in disability studies, there are models that are used to describe societal perceptions of disabilities. So for instance, one model that is quite popular, or it historically has been popular, is the medical model. And that's where impairments are seen kind of as deficiencies and something that ought to be fixed via medical or scientific advancement. So that's just one example. But to better understand the answer to your question, we have to fully understand the early modern response to congenital, or like you were saying, the impairments we're born with versus developed deafness. So in order to do that, we ought to reference a religious model of disabilities. The book that I drafted for my dissertation and have since revised defines this early modern religious model of disabilities as paramount to better understanding Western reception of disabilities then and now. So that's kind of the background. And now I'll try to answer your question. Though we do see some variances between Catholic worldview and Protestant worldview, one commonality between both is the interpretation of congenital disabilities, or those impairments that an individual is born with rather than develops or acquires. And the interpretation usually is as a manifestation for sin or punishment, the wrath of God, so on and so forth, all that hellfire and brimstone stuff. There are numerous biblical passages underpinning this perspective that frame deafness and blindness in unflattering metaphorical and literal terms. So this belief was bolstered by those religious texts, but also by a historical concept of physiognomy, which is just means a cosmological theory that peaked in the 16th century, arguing for a mutual influence or link between the body and the soul. So in other words, one could make a spiritual connection based on appearance. And a quote from Edwards is the outward signature or impression which shows inward virtue. Similarly, an impaired body could be interpreted using physiognomic principles as a physical manifestation of a corrupt or deformed soul that had been warped by sin. The root of this sin shifted after the Reformation. So we do have now a slight divergence in perception, because under a Catholic worldview, it was more common to interpret congenital impairments as an evidence of generational or even individual sin or wrongdoing. Whereas in a Protestant worldview, it became more popular to view congenital impairments as a consequence of just a fallen world. So that post-lapsarian universe caused by the events in the Garden of Eden. Because of the shift in thought regarding sin, which emphasized mankind generally rather than specifically man or an individual man, whenever disabilities in terms of physical suffering, disease, ailment, or impairment were addressed at the early modern pulpit, it was largely in reference to the metaphorical import and not necessarily as an explanation for personal failure.
Was deafness considered a condition to be cured in Shakespeare's lifetime? You mentioned that medical model earlier. Was that a mindset was present in Shakespeare's lifetime concerning deafness?
So unfortunately, the literature doesn't suggest that. And again, this is largely a result of the shifting doctrine after the Protestant Reformation. So for both the impaired and the able-bodied early modern population, physical impairments were viewed as an affliction forced upon an otherwise healthy or quote-unquote normal body. So in the Middle Ages, this otherwise normal body could be restored through miraculous cure. Someone could go on a pilgrimage, and with a divine relic, they might have this miraculous cure of their ailment. However, the Reformed Church held extreme suspicion for reliquary miracles and went so far as to claim that God had stopped authorizing miracles in roughly the 4th century when Rome converted to Christianity, and that there was now, quote, no more need of new miracles. And that's from John Hooper, who was a bishop in the early modern time period. This view was extreme and reactionary, so it's clearly true that the Church of England was seeking to distance itself from Rome and undermine Catholicism as a legitimate faith system as they tried to develop their own Church of England. So it's just an unfortunate consequence that that sense of the miraculous and the hope for divine cure was pretty much excised from a post-Reformation world. And as has been suggested by other researchers, the rejection of the possibility for miracles held direct implications regarding the perceptions of early modern disabilities. So Keith Thomas claims that the Protestant Reformation undercut Catholic belief and practice. And his quote is that by depreciating the miracle working aspect of religion and elevating the importance of an individual's faith in God, a new concept of religion itself as belief began to be elevated above practice. So, whereas medieval notions of disabilities fully supported miraculous healing and even used such events as proof for saintly canonization, the early modern Church of England began to deny the existence of miracles and removed the hope for any such miraculous occurrence. Far from being viewed as a potential site for miraculous healing and then a testimony for God's continued presence in daily life, the disabled body more often became a site of suspicion connected with Catholic trickery after the Reformation.
Do you think that the lack of a development of seeing deafness as something to be cured was related to the fact that medical science had no advancements during Shakespeare's lifetime to be able to even approach trying to cure it?
I think that that would be a viable explanation. There really wasn't any deaf pedagogy or any that's recorded in Shakespeare's time period. It's really in around 1630, 1640 that you start seeing this development of interest about deaf pedagogy. And though I don't go into a lot of detail, there were people like William Holder, who was a natural philosopher, and he believed that deafness could be cured by, he would bang a drum near Alexander Popham's ear to try and what he thought was create tension in the eardrum and create sound. So not necessarily a method that we would encourage today, but there was some speculation that there could be a physical way of redirecting deafness that just really wasn't true.
There was a budding interest in the fact that the inner ear had parts, and you could see the foundations being laid for what would later become what we know as cochlear implants and other kinds of ways of reversing deafness that exists today. You could see people asking those questions, but they definitely didn't have anything effective at this time.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely proto-development of things and certainly a scientific interest in curing deafness, at least in the mid-17th century.
Were there any options for education of the deaf in Shakespeare's lifetime, and what might that have looked like?
So there were not necessarily in England. In terms of the literature that we have as a frame of reference, the deaf education that was happening really in Shakespeare's time was happening in Spain. So during that time period, there was like a rather large population of Spanish nobility that were born deaf. And there were different religious and really non-religious individuals who were undertaking to educate the deaf. And the works that they published were then used in reference in the development of deaf education in England about a century later. So there was an interest, but it wasn't in England, if that answers your question.
What were they doing in Spain to educate the deaf?
Yeah, there were different approaches. So Pedro Ponce de Leon was really the first Spanish monk who began to try and educate the deaf. And he did so because his motivation was not only, to try and help these parents who were trying to make their children eligible for primogeniture or inheritance, but he was also influenced and motivated by his own kind of religious burden to try and make faith accessible to these people who had no access to faith because they weren't taught to read and because they couldn't hear at the pulpit any of the faith being spoken. So he was trying to open up those doors for salvation. There were several other Spanish individuals during that time who kind of used Pedro Ponce de Leon's methodology as their own influence to developing the successful education of the deaf. So one of those men was Don Manuel Ramirez de Carrion, and he was another Spanish teacher of the deaf who had learned his techniques from Pedro Ponce, but he was not willing to share his methods. He kept them very close to the vest. So we don't really know about his methods. The other individual who has become very well known in the field of deaf education is Juan Pablo Bonet. And he's received worldwide and really centuries-long fame for his own instruction of the deaf and the influence that it's had over the development of deaf pedagogy, primarily because he published the first manual for the instruction of the deaf. And the name of that in English is The Simplification of the Letters of the Alphabet and Method of Teaching Deaf Mutes to Speak. The Spanish title is Reducción de las Letras y Arte para Enseñar a Hablar los Mudos. So if you're wanting to look that up, he published that in 1620. So again, this is very near Shakespeare's time period. I have a bit of a problem with Bonnet's book because he's considered kind of the progenitor of deaf education when really we know that there were individuals before him that had developed it and that he most likely used some of their methods and then kind of claimed them as his own. So I've got a little beef with him, but he is nevertheless very famous for the contribution he made in deaf education.
And if your Spanish is a little shaky or you couldn't type the English title fast enough, we'll place links to these in the show notes as well. You referred to this earlier with Pedro Ponce de Leon and the problem he identified educating the deaf. But one reason members of deaf culture were not being taught to read is that when you teach someone to read, there's a great emphasis placed on the sounding out of letters and specifically phonetics as the foundation for reading skills. For a deaf person who can't hear those sounds, how were they taught to read in the 16th and 17th century?
Great question. And interestingly enough, many of the pedagogues or instructors of the 17th century were more determined to teach deaf pupils to speak than they were to teach them to write or read. So teaching the deaf to write was considered a useful skill, but it was also considered kind of a stepping stone towards utterance. In that time, many legal proceedings, such as the passage of inheritance, which again in Spain was a huge deal and also was in England, the passage of that inheritance was dependent upon vocalization in many cases. So pedagogues and linguists in the 17th century were more open to utilizing dactylology or finger spelling and natural signing as a resource in the acquisition of written and spoken standard English. However, it was clear that the goal was eventually to do away with signing in favor of English. It really was, their purpose was to acquire English. So most use recognition as a common ground. So they would find a physical object and they would teach the student the word for that object, spelling it out by writing after they had taught the alphabet until the student recognized the written word and associated it with the physical object. Now, to your question of how would they actually teach them to do this when they couldn't hear, for William Holder, one of the educators of that deaf young man I mentioned before, Alexander Popham, he would teach the alphabet via writing as the imperative first step. And that would help the pupil to learn to write and read as others can. But also, he would do this because the acquisition of speech by sight depended upon an understanding of articulation. So to accomplish teaching the deaf to speak by sight, Holder's instruction began with teaching, again, that alphabet until Popham could write his letters. Holder's directions then for teaching speech always began with the instruction to write the word. So he would test the knowledge of Popham before then he offered the supplemental tool to make signs, but not necessarily naturally signing, but gestures such as pointing at the desired word that he wanted Popham to pronounce, and then to personally demonstrate on his own lips how to pronounce various phonemes. So taking a letter at a time, the instructor, or Holder in this case, would have the student write the letter before having him observe the pronunciation of it on the lips of the instructor. The student would then be encouraged to attempt that utterance. Once the student correctly pronounced the letter, the instructor was to show him, and this is a quote, show him upon the paper the letter he pronounced to reinforce his understanding of the letter and its pronunciation, and then reward the student with, quote, much applauding and encouraging before having the student repeat it often until, quote, again, he be very perfect, both in the pronunciation and in the written character of the letter. So through painstaking description and most likely some aspect of show and tell through gesture, instructors tutored deaf students on recognizing where to place tongues, the teeth, the lips in pronouncing specific phonemes or syllables. And they usually would have some kind of wooden and cloth model of the mouth and tongue to show placement before then doing it with their own. And they might have even had the student place it. They might say pronounce T and have the student place the tongue where he thinks it should be, whether that's lateral placement near the teeth, near the throat, or vertical or horizontal placement at the roof of the mouth or at the floor of the mouth. Then the instructor would teach pupils how to shape, move, or even close their lips in the vocalization of different consonants and vowels. And in this way, deaf students in that century were taught as much as possible how to strike the proper tone while making utterances. And understandably, mimicking speech depended entirely on the individual instructor's subjective interpretation of proper pronunciation, as well as in their own skill in imparting concepts of sound to those who had no concept of sound. It also depended on the student's own self-perception, teachability, and recognition of the constriction or relaxation of muscles in the throat as a means of controlling pitch, or the placement of sound in the throat rather than the adenoidal passages to avoid nasal resonance.
What about manuals or printed books that might explain sign language, like a dictionary, perhaps, for different 16th and 17th century signs? Were there any of these in existence for Shakespeare's lifetime?
So, as I'd mentioned kind of briefly before, very few congenital deaf individuals were of high enough social status to be taught to write. We have pretty minimal records of people who were taught to write in England during that century. And so the records we do have of finger spelling or variant signs were largely recorded by hearing people, and primarily natural philosophers and physicians in the Royal Society who were attempting to teach the deaf to speak, to read, and to write through oralist focus. So again, their focus was how to teach the deaf to acquire English and have them speak so they could do away with sign and communicate with the larger population. Individuals who did use sign language regularly as a form of communication most often did so because they couldn't communicate via writing and speech, and because the goal at that time was, again, ultimately vocalization and not expanding natural signing or even recognizing it as a language. There are minimal references and even illustrations of finger spelling recorded in early modern publications. What we do have, I've included some graphics for you to share, but there are some by John Bulwer, William Holder, and John Wallace, and later in the Digiti Lingua of 1698. And these certainly laid a foundation for BSL, and particularly for the physical alphabet of BSL, but they were not there to teach sign language or even natural signing. Even in the case of John Bulwer, he had finger spelling and he had different signs, but it was meant to be almost like a secretive spy language for individuals who were wanting to communicate, I guess, espionage kind of like information without being caught.
As Mary mentioned, she did send over some graphics that show some of the finger spellings from this. It's actually mid to late 17th century, so after Shakespeare, but we've got these listed in the detailed show notes for our episode today, so stay tuned for information for where to find those. Mary, what books or manuals or records do we have, or even letters, I think you referenced earlier, of individuals from this time period that reveal some of the experiences of deaf people? I think of the marriage of Thomas and Ursula Russell, and I'm going to butcher Thomas's last name. I think it's Tilsey, but they were married in 1576 and sign language was used for their wedding ceremony. But are there other examples from this period of deaf people that we can point to that show us the culture that was there for Shakespeare's lifetime?
I love this question. There are certainly references to examples of deaf individuals who had taught themselves or who had been taught rudimentary signing as well as reading and writing by family members desperate to communicate. We can find those like in John Bulwer's texts again, or Anthony Dusing's arguments. He mentioned those as well. Bulwer even references a well-known merchant at the time who was deaf and was able to still communicate via sign. And he had a huge respect for sign language. And so in his text is one rare example of a natural philosopher or a physician who was interested in sign language as itself a communication system. Another striking example of these deaf individuals who were communicating via sign we can find in the extant letters of the Gaudy brothers. So John and Framlingham were their names. And in Peter Jackson's The Gaudy Manuscripts, which actually I have right here, the Gaudy Manuscripts, he has included photos of those original letters that were written to and from the family. And deafness in the Gaudy family was an inherited trait. So Sir William Gaudy, the father, and Elizabeth Duffields, of the 5 children that they had, 2 were born deaf, and they did not prevent them from education. In fact, both Framlingham and John were able to write, read, and in some cases, utter different languages or speech. As described in this book, the Gaudy Manuscripts, both brothers were part of a wealthy and landed family. Their father had a baronetcy that was later passed down to John because he could demonstrate his ability to read and write and was therefore eligible to claim his title as the surviving eldest son after his 2 elder brothers had died of smallpox. In addition to fluency in their own natural sign language, both actually were mute, so I was incorrect that they uttered, but they could read and write. John and Framlingham both proved capable of eloquent, fluent English. Framlingham, the younger brother, was the better letter writer and wrote more frequently rather than having a secretary write his signed or dictated letters. And in fact, Framlingham Gaudy may be one of the first, if not the very first, deaf individual who wrote his own will on May 2nd, 1672. So the will itself was signed by Framlingham, and there was an attestation on the back that said he had written it. So he often wrote his own letters, but John resorted more frequently to dictating his letters by sign to his wife, children, and close friends who all knew sign language, or natural signing, I should say. Both brothers became artists. They studied under Sir Peter Lely, and John was actually a limner, so he did small portraits. And in some of the letters, just kind of as an aside that's really interesting, Framlingham will mention someone in passing, or George Freeman, who was an art master who they studied under, was also fluent in natural signing because he had 2 daughters that were 10 to 15 years older than John and Framlingham, who were also deaf mutes. So it shows that there is this connection that could be made between deaf individuals in London, that they somehow knew each other and could communicate. One example of Freeman's understanding of Framlingham's signing was written in 1664, and he wrote, this is from the letter, Mr. Framlingham was somewhat discontented that he had no black clothes, for he made signs that the court was in mourning and that he was ashamed to go see his friend in his old ones. So clearly there's pretty complex description here that's being made. So you can see that there wouldn't be a finger spelling of the sentence. He would have signs to communicate this kind of discontent that he didn't have any clothes for mourning that would echo the mourning the court was in. So there wasn't probably a very large population of deaf people in London who could understand or sign, but there is evidence that, for instance, from another letter from George Freeman in 1665, he wasn't able to assist Framlingham while he was in one of his bouts of sickness. So Freeman suggested to Sir William to hire, quote, a good nurse that can sign to look after him. So whether or not this was accomplished, we don't really have a record of, but the suggestion itself is that there were nurses that could be found that signed, and that there were, again, larger individuals or populations in London where those who were deaf could sign with each other and could converse via natural signing. So even if most early modern authors of published handbooks for language acquisition didn't recognize natural signing as a language itself or a viable form of communication even, there were many individuals in close contact with the deaf in that time period who considered it just exactly that.
I know we would love to learn more about this topic. What are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend we use to explore this further?
I would recommend anyone to probably start with a book titled Teaching Language to a Boy Born Deaf. And this is by David Cram and Jap Mott. It was printed by Oxford University Press in 2017. And the reason I would suggest starting there is it's a very well-researched account of the education of Alexander Popham, who I mentioned before. It includes images and transcripts from the primary sources, namely the published texts of William Holder and John Wallis regarding their instruction of Popham. So that's a really good introductory text just to show how the deaf were taught to speak, read, and write during the time period. I'd also recommend Jennifer Nelson's Deaf Gain, Raising the Stakes for Human Diversity, which the University of Minnesota Press published in 2014. There's a chapter in it called Bulwer's Speaking Hands, Deafness and Rhetoric. And her research text, and specifically this chapter, would show a prominent figure in deaf pedagogy of the 17th century, John Bulwer. He's kind of my favorite of all of the pedagogues and natural philosophers of the time period, just because he was one of those individuals who was ahead of his time in recognizing the value of a gestural language and who recognized the ingenuity of deaf people in developing a language of their own with what ability that they had, a manual ability. And I guess the third one that I would recommend is the one that I held up here. So Peter Jackson's The Gaudy Manuscripts. And I think this text is really interesting because it features the letters of those two Gaudy brothers and gives a more thorough account of the lives of two deaf individuals who lived in the early modern time period. And it shows little glimpses in those letters of a community of deaf individuals in London who were communicating almost exclusively via sign. So I feel like those three would be a really good starting place.
These are wonderful places to start to explore the history of sign language from the 17th century, but they are far from the only ones Mary recommends. Earlier, Mary sent over a really great list of early modern resources along with scholarly resources about the topic of sign language from the 17th century, and we'll link to the ones that you're hearing today, as well as her entire other list of recommendations in the show notes for today's episode, so stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Mary, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Yeah, so I'm afraid academic life hasn't prepared me for extreme predicaments. So my husband told me this morning that I needed to take the worst case scenario, which is a survival handbook. But if I had my druthers, I'd probably take the collection of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in one big text, because it's been a lifelong favorite series of mine since childhood. And so I know that I could dive into it again and again without being bored.
That's an exciting choice. And yes, I think everything Bear Grylls has ever written would be at top of my list too. Like, let's make sure we can live while we're out there. And I'm always
so we
surprised
can read more books, right?
Exactly. Well, I'm always surprised by this question, which is why I love asking it, because you absolutely never know what someone is going to pick. And invariably, it's usually something entirely left field from whatever their expertise is in. So it's always a fun question.
Well, you already covered Shakespeare, so my period is pretty well covered there.
Yeah, we tried to set you up really well. So
yeah, I love it.
Well, what's next for you? I believe you have a publication coming out soon related to the history of sign language. Is that right?
My dissertation turned monograph and revised monograph is going to be submitted to a university press pretty soon. And I'm really crossing my fingers that it gets taken up sooner rather than later, just because I think it really needs to be a contribution to the field of early modern disability studies to better understand the influence of the Reformation in societal depictions of the deaf and blind, and really just larger populations of impaired individuals. But I actually have a second book project that is being contracted right now. So we're kind of in the underwriting, but the ink hasn't dried on the contract yet, but it'll involve deaf theater. And I'm co-writing with Brian Cheslick, Dr. Brian Cheslick, who is the artistic director of Deaf Austin Theater and is also an assistant professor. So he and I are teaming together for this book. And deaf theater has always it was my first dive into disability studies, because I was in this cool seminar called Dramatic Theory. And I started really getting interested in this deaf production of Romeo and Juliet. So worlds collided. and I just started researching more and more. And so it's kind of full circle with that initial study into deaf theater with this book that we're going to be writing about advancing accessibility with deaf theater.
That sounds like exciting things coming up for you.
Yeah.
We'll look forward to seeing that
you.
be published. Thank you so much, Mary Lutze, for joining us here today to share this exciting part of Shakespeare's lifetime and help us understand the history of sign language and deaf culture for the 16th and 17th century. I appreciate you being here to share it with us.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Mary has provided an extensive list of early modern resources, and we've packed them all into the show notes for today's episode. Find those at CassidyCash.com/episode 317. While you're there, you can expand our detailed show notes, and that includes 17th century diagrams of British Sign Language, some biographical information on the Gaudy brothers, as well as John Bulwer and some of the other educators of the deaf that you heard us talk about today. You can see their portraits, illustrations, manuals, and all of that packed into what's called the detailed show notes. The detailed show notes is the insider research that goes along with our episode. It's available to patrons of our show. You can use the Become a Patron button on our show notes page to log in as a patron or to join, if you're not already a patron of our show, to expand all of these extras. Again, you can find all of these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 317. That's CassidyCash.com/EP317. That Shakespeare Life is made possible by listeners just like you who sign up to be our patrons. To say thank you for supporting our show, patrons get insider access, including the detailed show notes, bonus episodes, and the opportunity to submit questions they want asked in an upcoming interview. Inside the patrons area, you'll also find a video library, virtual tours, and an entire educator section that maps out how to use our show to complete a full 35-week year of Shakespeare history, including coordinating activity kits that let you try out some of the history you hear about on the show at home or in your classroom. Find out more, explore all the extras, and sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.